All right, so we have 1 minute left. Thanks, everybody, for the questions. You made my job really easy. Just to bring it back to the topic of challenges in reducing Scope 3 emissions, I thought you could each just quickly think of like one challenge you've had, and since many in the audience may not be as far along on their Scope 3 journey, maybe you can give like one piece of advice.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats, our presentation is about to begin. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back your host, Bob Perciasepe.
All right, everyone. Take a deep breath, hold it, and then release. Thank you. It's great to see everybody back in the main room for our final plenary session this morning, and we're very excited about the lineup of speakers and information that you're going to get. But first up, it's really my honor to introduce the senior senator from Michigan, Senator Debbie Stabenow. So thank you so much for coming with us today, Senator. She's a national leader and has been for quite a while on the environment and addressing climate issues. I had the opportunity to work with her when I was the Deputy Administrator of EPA, and I know firsthand her intense love for the Great Lakes and also for her thoughtful legislator acumen on getting legislation done. She's the ranking member of the U.S. Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee. Somebody may have mentioned trees sometime during this conference, and had led successful efforts on the Farm Bill. We always call it the Farm Bill, but I think every time it gets some longer name. But basically, it's the framework for how we do agriculture. And every year we've done it, starting at least in 2014 when you were the chair, and then again in 2018 when you're ranking member. Great progress has been made in the Farm Bill in building in climate-smart agriculture policies that not only are looking at how to reduce the impact of agriculture, but also how to sequester carbon with agricultural practices, but also cut some of the other pollution along the way, like nitrogen and phosphorus. So this is all great, and make our farmers economically viable. So these balances are something that we have to do with all of the climate work we do, and the senator certainly has done that in the area of agriculture. She's also working on with the automobile industry on, as you might expect, being from Michigan, on cleaner vehicles, expanding education programs for American workers as we transition the energy economy, and also, and I mentioned this already, but I'll end and ask you to come on up, the Great Lakes, which are, as you all know, one of the great wonders of the United States and the world, and we share it with Canada. That was made clear several times. The Canadian ambassador was here. So, And it's a joint project to protect them between the two countries. So, Senator, welcome to the Climate Leadership Conference.
Good morning, good morning. We are not shaking hands anymore. I'm looking for things to touch. You know, in China they're doing feet now, and so we are, and I'm not making light of this, actually. You need to really be serious about this. But it is wonderful to be here and to have you in Detroit. I'm so glad you're in Detroit. We are so excited that you're here for Climate Leadership Conference, and I want to thank everyone who's been involved in putting this together. Bob, thank you, and your wonderful organization, America's Pledge on Climate Change. DTE, our host city sponsor, we're very proud of DTE and all the work that's going on, and it really is an opportunity while you are here, and I know you've been focused on it. The program looks terrific, but we really are seeing people coming together who are really leading the way on this incredible, incredible challenge, existential challenge and crisis in terms of pollution and the climate change. So thank you for being here. And I do have to say, I really don't think there's a better place to be talking about this than in the city of Detroit, because it's not only where we're impacted, and I want to share with you some of the impacts and what's happening for us in the climate crisis, but innovation is happening here. We are the city and the state of innovation, and I'm not just saying that because I represent Detroit in Michigan. This is absolutely, I will give you one data point. The first patent office, U.S. Senate Patent Office, that was established outside of Washington, D.C. a few years ago, was established here in Detroit, because we were the ones creating the new clean energy patents. And so there's a tremendous amount of, in fact, within 20 miles of where we are sitting right now, we have an incredible amount of innovation going on. And we are #1 in the Midwest in clean energy jobs being created. So we are focused, and we should be, because the climate crisis is not something happening later. It's been happening a long time. And we have to have an incredible sense of urgency to be able to get this done. And the good news, although late, is that we are seeing more and more people understand that and beginning to really pay attention and focus. And we need to take advantage of that, which is, again, why I'm glad you're here. We in Michigan really do feel like we are part of the ground zero here in terms of the climate crisis. Last October, I released a report that we took all the science, boiled it down to very practical things of how the crisis is affecting Michigan. I did an entire week swing around the state, focusing on this, from the clean energy patent innovation and jobs to what's happening on the lakes and what's happening with fishing, what's happening with agriculture, what's happening in public health. You know, we are not getting the frost and freezes as early as we used to, and so mosquitoes and other diseases are happening. There's a whole range of things that are happening that I thought was important to highlight. But let me just share a couple of things, and then I want to talk about solutions. In fact, the Great Lakes are heating up faster than the oceans. It was a report done just a while ago that, again, reiterated that. Great Lakes heating up faster than the oceans. In fact, Lake Superior, our beautiful, largest lake way up in the Upper Peninsula, is getting about 2 degrees warmer each decade and is one of the 5 fastest warming lakes in the world. And that's like flashing lights to us in terms of cold water fishing. I mean, the fact is that's good news for invasive species like sea lamprey that are threatening the Great Lakes' $8 billion recreation fishery. Bad news for people who care about fishing, who care about boating in water, and love our lakes. The warming lakes are also putting tourism at tremendous risk. It's about a $22 billion industry in Michigan, $22 billion, and supports about 200,000 jobs. In fact, what's interesting is 1 out of 5 jobs in Michigan is connected to the water in some way. So this is economic. By the way, this is also 40 million people get their drinking water from the Great Lakes, and it's very much about who we are in Michigan as well as in other areas. I also had the opportunity just a couple of weeks ago to spend a significant amount of time going around the state looking at what's happening because of rising water levels and the effect that that's having on lakeshore communities. We saw water and sewer treatment facilities and beaches and parks and docks that are being threatened by high water levels and erosion. Different kind of emergency, not currently really covered under FEMA in the same way. It's not one storm. It's storm after storm after storm after storm that's coming. And so we looked at the fact that it's going to take billions of dollars to address this. And this is another reason for a sense of urgency that we feel in Michigan. And then finally, among many things, I will just say that our farmers are right in the middle of it. Certainly, the severe weather is something that is not new to them, but what is happening over the chaotic nature of it certainly is getting worse and worse and worse. We in Michigan have more diversity of crops than any state but California. So, and who cares about California, right? You know, Michigan blueberries, cherries, apples. You know, we have more. We have great diversity. But last spring, excessive rain caused devastating planting delays all across the Midwest, including here. When we're #1 in tart cherries, and when it warms up in February and the trees think that it's spring and they blossom, and then we have a freeze in April. A few years ago, it wiped out 90% of the crop, and that could happen again at any time. So we can't afford in Michigan, nor can we anywhere in this country or the world, to have another lost decade when it comes to addressing the climate crisis. And the good news is that we in Michigan, as well as in the country, but we feel we are poised to be leaders in the solution. And I would say it's not one solution, it's different ways. As we know, there's not one silver bullet, there's thousands of silver bullets that we need to be arming ourselves with. And I'm very proud of the things that are happening here in Michigan. DTE and Consumers Energy are two major utilities, and we're among the first in the nation to roll out plans to achieve net zero carbon emissions. When we look at automobiles, it's not just smokestacks, it's the tailpipe, as we know. And in fact, the transportation sector is the largest single source of carbon pollution, as we know. And this is something that we are very focused on in our industries are right now. Now, we could argue things should have come sooner. Absolutely. There's a lot of things that should come faster, sooner. The good news is that people are laser focused on getting to where we need to be as quickly as possible. And I will note that you are very close to the home of Henry Ford, just down the road in Dearborn, and the assembly line that created the middle class of our country. And it was 100 years ago that Henry Ford partnered with Thomas Edison to build an affordable electric car, 100 years ago. They even built several prototypes in Dearborn. And in 1914, Henry Ford told the New York Times, the challenge is to build a storage battery of light weight which will operate for long distances without recharging. And boy, do our folks still realize that in what is happening. And I mean, that challenge is here right in front of us. But in the end, and some of this was very much policies, tax policies and other things, batteries lost, fossil fuels won. Fortunately, we can change that. And we have to be urgently changing that now. The benefits of electric and hydrogen cars are clear. We know that we're tackling the single largest source of carbon pollution. When we do that, we can create great jobs. I talk a lot about jobs because this is not about having survival of the planet and clean air and stopping the chaos and the weather versus jobs, it's about jobs as well. And when people talk about a large wind turbine, they talk about renewable energy, alternative energy. I see 8,000 parts, and they can be manufactured in Michigan. So we need to be continually talking about this as an economic revolution as well as what we need to be doing on the climate crisis. And frankly, we can't cede this global leadership to China. I'm sure you've talked about it, but the Chinese government has invested at least $60 billion to support its electric vehicle industry. There are more than 400 Chinese companies making electric cars. And we can't cede this in the United States. It is key. EVs are key to keeping the auto industry competitive long term. And the good news is that the companies are rolling out. In fact, even today in Detroit, there's an exhibition about what's going to be happening between now and 2025 on all electric vehicles. And people are pushing very aggressively. But we're not going to get there without some infrastructure support and some other things that need to happen. And for that reason, last year I introduced the Driving America Forward Act, which is bipartisan with Senator Lamar Alexander and Senator Gary Peters to extend the electric and fuel cell vehicles tax credit, which we need to do, I believe, one more time, not extensively, but we need, until we get that price point, until we get the volume, that needs to be done. I'm working aggressively, in fact, as late as yesterday, to get that brought up for a vote. We have an energy bill in front of us, and we need to be including a tax package on clean energy, and certainly including this tax package. But while I'm working very aggressively to get this up for a vote, the oil industry is working just as aggressively to stop the vote. And so we need your voice and your help right now if we're going to move forward on the tax front. I'm co-chair of the Finance Committee's Bipartisan Energy Task Force, and we have, in fact, laid out a host of green energy tax incentives. Equally important, I believe we need to be driving adoption of EVs so that we compete without incentives in the future. And I think we can do that in the near future if we're doing the right thing, because we are seeing changes happening very rapidly. We are seeing demand growing, sales increased by more than 80% in 2018. That's great, the percentage is great. Now, it's still only, at this point, 1 million EVs on the roads. It's projected in the next 10 years, we're looking at 19 or 20 million. You know, I was thinking today as we were driving in from the airport that EVs remind me a little bit like Joe Biden winning South Carolina. And what I mean by that is once people see a path, it's convenient charging stations, it's affordable prices, people tell them it's okay. There's all this pent-up demand here, right? And when they see electric trucks, which are going to be rolling out, as well as small vehicles, people are going to rush to electric vehicles. So let's do it like South Carolina did it and roll it in. But the truth of the matter is, to do that, we need nearly 10 million charging stations. But people are going to see that. I mean, when people see that they can spend less money in an electric vehicle and it's easy to do, I do believe that pent-up demand is there and that people will choose that. But we are right at the point where it's just not quite there, which is why the extension of the tax credit, which is why charging stations are so important. The Senate Environmental and Public Works Committee highway bill, we poured it out on a bipartisan basis, sitting on the Senate floor. We're waiting for action. Actually would include $1 billion in investments, grants for states and local governments for fueling infrastructure. Very, very important that we get that done. Let me also speak to, on the tax side, something that I've heard over and over again now as a senior member of the Finance Committee in the Senate. We hear all the time from our friends in the oil companies that we shouldn't pick winners and losers. Well, we picked a winner 100 years ago in the tax code, and they won. The only incentives built into the tax code for 100 years have been for oil and gas. What we're trying to do is just level the playing field and giving equal opportunity to competing technologies. That's what this is about. So as we do that, we're going to see electric range continuing to increase. Battery prices have already fallen by 80% since 2010. It's now half as much to operate an EV as a gas-powered automobile. And so I believe there's this virtual cycle, again, that has started. And as I mentioned, it's sort of having that break where people then suddenly turn and decide to do it. And I loved seeing the Super Bowl this year where there was ads from GM, Ford, and other automakers touting new electric vehicles. We haven't seen that before. This is why I believe we're right on the edge of being able to move if we can all do it together. Let me also mention the other big part of our economy, 1 in 4 jobs, is in agriculture. And this is where keeping carbon in the ground, keeping it in our trees, having the smart climate technologies and policies in agriculture is so important. And we are uniquely poised to address this. And for decades, producers have been doing voluntary climate-smart conservation practices like cover crops and no-till farming. Since 2012, we've seen a number of farms through our energy title in the Farm Bill installing renewable energy like solar panels at the farm and aerobic digesters. And we've seen those things double in the last few years because we've been able to put funding in to help make that happen. And we've cut energy consumption emissions and costs for them. The 2018 Farm Bill had the most climate-smart policies we've had to date, but they need to be ramped up. And the good news is we're seeing now traditional agricultural groups that are leaning in with us that want to do that have never been willing to do that before or even acknowledge that the climate crisis was real. So we're seeing things like we put in crop insurance so you can incentivize cover crops, alfalfa, or some other cover crops that hold the soil in place and deal with runoff issues, and working lands conservation and forest health initiatives that are helping producers sequester carbon and improve sustainability. What we need, I believe, in this area is not to think up new things. We just need to be more aggressive about it. We need to do much more of what can be done in this area, and I think this is an important part of getting our arms around the climate crisis. Last year, Chairman Roberts and I held the first and amazingly only bipartisan hearing so far on climate change in agriculture, where the words climate crisis was actually in the title of the hearing. When I was chair 2011, 12, 13, I wanted to do a hearing on the climate crisis. I could not get the support that was necessary to do that, so I did a hearing on severe weather. And we talked about the climate crisis. This time it's actually in the title. I can't tell you how significant that was to be able to get that done. And we're seeing bipartisan interest, ag groups that are stepping up that are willing to work with us to create an accountable way to measure carbon and assign value to that, which is going to be very important as we move forward. And we have multiple groups in the Senate. The one bipartisan group, there's something called the Climate Solutions Caucus, and so far there are 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans chairing the energy chair, myself, ag, others that are in key positions that are now routinely meeting to figure out if we can find some common ground here. For ag producers, what I call land-based solutions are a win-win because sustainability and profitability go hand in hand. They can improve their operations, build new revenue streams through valuing carbon as a commodity, all while addressing the climate crisis. And we're finally getting real attention where folks want to talk to me about that and figure out what we can do. And we know that land-based climate solutions, it's estimated, if we do this through farms and forests, could cancel out emissions from over 100 million cars per year. Now, we still want you to buy the car made in Michigan. We still want you to buy the automobile. But emissions from over 100 million cars by doing what we can do on the carbon sequestration side. So that's a very big deal, and it's one of the 1,000 silver bullets that we need. So let me just close by thanking you for being here and saying your voice on the public policy end of things is needed now more than ever, and it's the right time. People are more willing to listen. There's still a big fight, but we're now poised to make things happen, and we need to be leaning in, and we need you to be pushing to make sure the right kind of smart policies are done to be able to address what needs to happen. I'm optimistic, even though this is huge, to be able to get this done. I'm also determined. We are a country of innovators. Certainly, Michigan is a place of innovation. It's going to take all of our talent in innovation and commitment to be able to do this. We can do it. We have to do it. Henry Ford once said this: "What's right about America is that although we have a mess of problems, we have great capacity, intellect, and resources to do something about it." There's no doubt the climate crisis is a huge and urgent challenge. But I believe Henry Ford was right. We do have capacity, intellect, and resources to do something about it, and I'm anxious to be your partner in getting that done. Thank you. Did you want to take questions or not? Okay, good.
You know, Senator, the internal combustion engine is what's in the cars, most cars today, as opposed to a electric motor. And what is this city's nickname? Right there. See, you're already on it. They knew something back when they picked that. All right. I always said, why isn't the engine city? Thanks so much, Senator. Really pleased that you were able to join us today. So our next speaker, you know, there's a very quick thing about Massachusetts, because that's our next speaker is going to talk about transportation. It's from Massachusetts. When I became the Secretary of Environment in Maryland, and I want to point out it's a state that begins with an M and an A, has a bay, and a city that has a B. So it's about 6 million people. It's an isomer, those of you who... when I... the chemists are getting excited. So when I was the Secretary of Environment there, one of the very first meetings I had was with Sue Tierney, who had Katie's job back in the 90s, and we sat there and tried to concoct, you know, East Coast stuff. And I want to say it was the leadership of the whole state, and it continues today. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the Northeast, and also particularly in Massachusetts. And I'm very pleased that Katie Theoharides is here to join us. She's the Secretary of Energy, Environmental Affairs in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I think it's one of the 3 states that's called a Commonwealth. I think it's 3. And as I just mentioned, and I wanted to do this, you know, that there's a strong history here in Massachusetts of leadership on not just the state, but regional environmental issues. Because in fact, a lot of the New England area and Mid-Atlantic area, you really can't solve the problems yourself. You have to do it with the other states. Whether it's the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, you got to have Pennsylvania do something. Whether it's air pollution, if the states in the Mid-Atlantic don't do something, the states in the Northeast are affected. And so that history, that culture of working on these problems together is one of the things that Massachusetts brings, and Katie exemplifies that work. And so, Katie, I'm going to invite you on up to give us a little guided tour of what's going on transportation and also in Massachusetts. Thanks.
Keep forgetting. Well, good morning. Thank you, everyone. And thanks so much to Bob and to Jessica for the invitation and for bringing this great group of people together. It is always a true pleasure to be in a room of friends. And I consider you all friends. You're all working on this challenge. You are all using your best ideas, your energy, your blood, sweat, and tears to make a difference on this challenge. I do want to talk a little bit about the challenge we're seeing in Massachusetts, as well as the work we're doing on the transportation sector specifically, but it really has been just a tremendous opportunity over the last couple of sessions to hear what's going on in other states with other businesses across the region. In Massachusetts, climate change is something we approach in a very bipartisan manner. This is not a political issue. We've seen the impacts, we've seen the science, we know it's real, and we are moving forward very aggressively with a strong history behind us of addressing climate change. Where do I point this? Okay. Obviously, I don't have to tell anyone in this room about the impacts, but we've been seeing them now for some time, and they are diverse in terms of what they're bringing to our state, in terms of what they're bringing across the country. Everything from the spring of 2018, when we had 3 nor'easters back to back, having dumpsters floating down through the streets of Boston, to a hurricane in 2012 that actually floated a building down through the town of Shelburne Falls and closed restaurants and businesses for many months. And these impacts obviously are projected to grow, and so we're doing a lot on the resiliency end to learn to deal with these impacts. But our first line of defense, of course, is really mitigating the impacts. On the resiliency side, we launched a program in 2017, a partnership between state government and local communities. And I think what was most inspiring there is in less than 3 years, 82% of our communities across the state have come in and said, hey, we want to partner with the state. We want to plan to address resiliency and to build climate adaptation across our communities. Here's a look at what we're seeing in Massachusetts, both observed changes as well as changes that we expect to see by the end of the century. We're looking for around 7.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And obviously, average temperatures are not what affect us as much as changes like the one below, which is the number of 90-degree days in the summer. This one's really striking to me, and we've already seen it go up from, we have around 11 days above 90 in the summer in the Boston area, in a region that really doesn't have significant air conditioning yet, although it continues to increase. By the end of the century, we may see as many as 3 months of days above 90 degrees. So our entire summer may be above 90 degrees. And this really starts to hit home with populations that have respiratory illnesses and disease, with elderly populations, with children. I know the summer of 2018, the month of August, not only was it 90 degrees most days, but the nighttime temperature did not fall below 70. And for folks who don't have air conditioning, this is a big deal. Your body does not get to recover at night, and that sets you up for an even harder day the following day. I was 8.5 months pregnant, and we don't have air conditioning, so I felt this. I actually saw this is going to be a challenge going into the future. Sea level rise, certainly an issue for us being on the coast. The large part of our economy is within areas that are projected to have significant impacts from sea level rise. And we're looking at something on the order of 10 feet by the end of the century, depending on what happens with the icebergs and obviously which trajectory emissions go on. For precipitation, the Northeast, and anyone from the Northeast is probably familiar with this, we've already seen a 55% increase in the number of high-volume precipitation events, and again, are expected to see significantly more of that by the end of the century. So our governor, Governor Baker, in his State of the Commonwealth this January, doubled down on our climate goals. We address climate change across every sector of the state. It's not just an environmental issue. He actually laid out an executive order in 2016 that said all of our secretariats, all of our agencies need to be responding to climate change, and we need to work in partnership with locals and federals and other states on this issue. We have a Global Warming Solutions Act from 2008, one of the first in the country, set an 80% target for emission reductions by mid-century. As the science started to come out in 2018 that said to avoid these impacts, to avoid the worst impacts, we really need to limit things to 1.5 degrees of centigrade increase. And to do that, we need to get to net zero. We started looking at that as a state and said, hey, how do we start shifting our plans to this more aggressive goal? And so in the governor's State of the Commonwealth, he committed us to a new target of net zero. We are now one of about 4 states and a handful of countries that has adopted that goal. And I think, you know, our delay on adopting it was only due to the fact that we think goals are critical, science-backed goals in particular, but if you can't back up those goals with a roadmap for how you're going to get there and concrete action to show people the way, then it's just a goal. And so we're working on a 2050 roadmap right now that would lay out the policies and strategies to get us there in the most cost-effective, equitable, and achievable way across the state, but more importantly, how can we spur this action beyond our own state borders? The figure you're seeing is our initial goals with the hatched line. The dotted line below it is where we have to go in terms of the emissions we're producing. And then we, somewhat similar to Michigan, are very lucky in the fact that we have a large carbon sink in our land base. We're about 60% forested. We have a strong farming and agricultural community. And the work we can do to sequester some of the remaining emissions in state is going to also be an important part of our net zero strategy. Obviously, the work needs to continue across all sectors. And so we are looking at our 1990 level emissions as our baseline and trying to get 25% below that by 2020, and then to net zero by 2050. We've seen significant gains in the electricity sector, right? And I think this is a common trend across the country. Our work through the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, fuel switching from oil and coal to natural gas, as well as getting clean power onto our grid has really made a difference here. And we've made significant reductions, some good reductions across the building sector as we invest in energy efficiency. But the sector that continues to go up is our transportation sector, and it's now about 42% of our emissions across the state, a number that really mirrors numbers across our northeastern region, where it gets even higher in states like Vermont and Maine. Bob spoke to the interconnectedness of our region. We share roadways, we share economies, we share the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and we share similar levels of ambition and an urgency on climate change and a history of working on this challenge together. These are goals for the states that have been involved in the Transportation Climate Initiative, which I'm going to talk about more in a minute. But you can see that every state on this list has ambitious goals over the coming decade and into the middle of the century. And I think there is a strong realization in this group of states that A, we can't work on this by ourselves. In our region, we really need to work on this together. And B, this is the decade that we can't lose. We've lost a lot of decades, right? We're at the point where we have to start turning every dial, every knob we can turn and working on this as it is a crisis and there's really not any time left. And so that has led us, we've been working with the Georgetown Climate Center, some of us for over the last 10 years, but really more specifically in the last 5 to 3 years on setting up a regional cap and invest program for the transportation sector. It's modeled very heavily on the success of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, but to give you a sense of the scale of the opportunity. So it's 12 states and the District of Columbia, and it's 72 million people, 52 million vehicles, and $5.3 trillion in GDP across the region. Even more importantly, the emissions that could be captured by this market are about 3.5 times the emissions that are captured under the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative market. So a really big opportunity to reduce emissions for our own state goals, but more importantly, to reduce emissions on a global scale. And then the investment side of this, when you set up a cap and trade program, you're looking at what can you do with the revenue that's generated. This is also significant. So somewhere on the order of around up to $5.5 billion annually. To give you a sense of that, the RGGI program, $3.3 billion over the 10-year life of the program. Or another way we think about this in Massachusetts is we got $76 million from the Volkswagen settlement. We were able to invest in clean transportation. So this money is really game-changing in terms of the investments we can make in bringing our transportation system into the future. Many of you know how cap and invest programs work. There's a cap on emissions. The allowances are traded. And the allowances are based on the carbon content of fuels. They're auctioned off, and then they can be invested by each state back into transitioning their transportation sector. And we see a lot of advantages over using a market rather than just looking at other mechanisms like a gas tax, for example. That has been something that's on the table as well. So the point of regulation here is far upstream. It's placed on the fuel supplier levels. Basically, the distributor who is removing it from the terminal rack is the person who's responsible for paying for allowances based on the fuel they're selling into a state and based on the carbon content of that fuel. This offers a lot of opportunities for innovation to reduce the costs for suppliers. And then this is a situation where markets have historically delivered much lower prices than other systems. And of course, the investments are critical to bringing down, well, basically to offering the opportunities for people to reduce their carbon footprint in the transportation space. Also, looking at the caps that we've been studying through the TCI process, the figure on your right shows the price impacts to consumers of the cap levels we're looking at. And so you can see on the left is the historical variation in commodity prices, in this case in gas. The levels that we're looking at have an impact far lower than some of the variation we're already seeing from gas. I'm trying to speed through this because my time, I think, is up, but I have a couple more slides. The key piece here is investment. You can't set the cap too low before you actually have options in place to allow people to make other choices. And so that is really where the opportunity lies here, not only for changing our infrastructure, for providing other options, but for really forging the innovation that we need to start transitioning people into a cleaner transportation space. We're certainly looking at everything on the table, from electrification of buses to rebates for EVs to things for rural communities like better internet connectivity. Some of the modeling we've done has looked at some of the numbers of things we can put out. In the first 10 years, 44,000 transit buses across the region, 84,000 electric trucks. And we are also seeing benefits, importantly, to the region in terms of public health and avoided climate change impacts. $10 billion in public health. This is really key to many of our cities, which are already overburdened by air pollution. This would have a significant public health benefit in addition to the avoided costs of climate change. also has a rural component. We are all states that have significant urban cores, but also significant rural populations, agricultural centers, and places where the solutions to reducing transportation sector emissions are going to be very different than the solutions in urban communities. And so we've been working very hard to make sure the package of investments we're designing would have benefits for rural communities as well. And finally, I think one of the keys to this effort has been the strong support we've seen not only from the environmental sector, but from the business community. We've had significant leadership from groups as far-ranging as Schneider Electric and Toyota to BP and Enel, and they are really creating the space for their governors to look at this in a serious way and to get on board. And I would just say to those of you in the room who can add your voice to this fight, because it is, anytime you try to do something that might have an impact on gas prices, you're up against some pretty good forces. But anyone in this room who can join the effort to try to give your governor the space to work on this, that's a key part. I think the other key ask for this room is that this is an opportunity to tell the story of what investments are possible. And we are working to do that at the state level, but we don't have the full range of vision. And so for those of you who work in the innovation space, who are looking at what is possible in your businesses to sort of facilitate this pathway forward, we will be looking to all of you to help us tell the story of what a better, cleaner transportation future looks like for all of our communities and the benefits it can provide. So with that, thank you very much for the opportunity, and we will keep moving forward on this.
All right. We have empty chairs up here, so I'm going to ask my two partners in this next round to join me. I also, Katie, want to thank you for that excellent presentation. Also, the amazing work that Massachusetts is doing and the leadership that the state is providing, and yourself and the governor to the whole Northeast. Kudos, and it's undoubtedly going to continue to spread, I'm hoping. Joining me here now is Steve Harper, who's the Vice President of Public Policy at, Global Director, I'm sorry.
Thanks for the promotion.
If you want one, I'll give you one. Right. He's the Global Director for Environment, Energy, and Sustainability Policy at Intel. Anybody ever hear of Intel? All right. And oh, it's one of those days.
It's all downhill from here.
Jim is the Vice President of Public Policy at Rivian. For those of you not familiar with Rivian, they make very cool electric trucks and SUVs, and we'll see a little bit of that in a few moments. But I'm welcoming you guys up here because we're gonna talk a little bit about technology, and the technologies you guys are working on are different, but I'm guessing they have some relationships to each other. You know, the senator was just talking about electric vehicles being manufactured in Michigan. Where is it that you guys manufacture your?
Well, our vehicle design and engineering center is here in Michigan.
Right. Yes. So, and Steve, you often talk about not the footprint of Intel, but the handprint. You know, of how the technology is used in different places. And I'm guessing that the handprint is going to be fundamental here to a lot of the technologies that we've been talking about for the whole conference and the whole digitization process. So I'm going to sit now, and we're going to have a chat here. And I'm going to ask each of you, and I'll start with Jim, to talk a little bit about how you see the work of the technology you guys are working on. How does that work in the scheme of the mission goals that you hear states adopting, you hear companies adopting, because you're also looking at working vehicles. You know, how does that work, and how does that work with the Paris Agreement? And so both of you will answer this question, but we'll start with you, Jim. And I think we're going to run
Yeah, so there's
we're going to run a
can...
silent video while he's talking so you can see one of their products.
So hopefully the video works. Yes, excellent. So Rivian was founded back in 2009 by R.J. Scaringe, PhD mechanical engineer out of MIT, and actually started out in Florida and wanted to develop all-electric adventure vehicles. So R.J. is a great outdoorsman, loved getting out to the beach, to the mountains, but always felt a little guilty because he was taking a vehicle that is a segment which creates the largest amount of pollution of all vehicles. So he's thinking there's got to be a better way to do this, and the platform should be all electric. So I mentioned 2009 as our founding, and everyone's like, well, where the heck have you been for like 10 years? Well, we've been perfecting this technology. So the classic model for a lot of electric vehicle companies is to talk about cool technology, put out a prototype that's what we call in the industry a pusher, that you push on stage or that has just enough power to get on stage. RJ didn't want to do that. He wanted to show a vehicle that could actually operate, that would be all the features that people would want. So you saw it flashed up on the screen, 400 miles of range. This vehicle is actually a fully developed Rivian vehicle that does have that 400-mile battery pack in it. We've designed it with a motor at each wheel so that you can go 0 to 60 in 3 seconds in a pickup truck. So you can outrun a Porsche 911 in a pickup truck. It's taking advantage of all the aspects of electric drive. It has, because of the motor at each wheel, it has incredible traction control. And it can literally run on one wheel as necessary. We designed it for the off-road adventure, but in a zero emissions package. And so it has incredible technology, incredible capability. The video is showing a segment of what we call our Rivian tank turn, where if you get to the end of a trailhead and there's no place to turn around, you don't have to do the 1,000-point turn. You just drive the torque on the wheels one way, on one side, and drive the torque on the other way, and basically spin the vehicle on its own axis. All in, again, all in a zero emissions package. Air suspension that allows incredible ride clearance and ride height. And being able to do this in a package that has all the storage that you saw at the beginning of this vehicle. So not only the truck bed, but the gear tunnel that was along transverse to the vehicle, the front trunk area, in an all-wheel drive pickup truck that tows 11,000 pounds, that has sealed components that allows you to wade through 3 feet of water. And as you can see from the pictures on this video, capability of a pickup truck bed that will hold 1,700 pounds. So you can put that tent up there. The idea is to be able to enable that adventure, but in an all-electric zero emissions package. Thank you. I should have added also, we didn't want to do this and then, try to talk about production timeframes of 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So when we unveiled this vehicle at the LA Auto Show in 2018, we announced that production would go into effect at the 4th quarter of this year. And in fact, we are on track to be able to produce vehicles in our factory starting this year.
And I think it's pretty obvious it's pretty obvious what the need for these kinds of vehicles are, and also the delivery vehicles, and that are also in your planning horizon.
Yeah, so
for reducing emissions and dealing with some of the goals that the states and companies have.
Right, so it's not just about the pickup trucks, and by the way, there's an SUV version as well, the 3-row, 7-seat SUV, and they'll come in ranges of 230 miles of range, 300 miles of range, and as you saw in the video, up to 400 miles of range. The idea is every one of these vehicles that is sold supplants the gasoline-powered equivalent, taking that many more emissions out of the fleet as a whole. On top of that, that's our business-to-consumer side of our business. We also have a B2B or business-to-business side, and there was a press announcement last year where we partnered with Amazon, who is one of our investors, and they committed in a contract to order 100,000 all-electric, medium-duty delivery vehicles. So these are the FedEx, UPS-sized delivery trucks that they're going to start rolling out. We're going to start producing those next year in 2021, 100,000 vehicles delivered by 2030. Amazon will be rolling those out as their prime delivery fleet, so you will have a zero emissions vehicle delivering packages in neighborhoods.
Yeah. So that's it's critical to all the plans and everything else that people have been talking about. And you heard from the senator how proud she is of the automobile industry in general and how they're moving in this direction. Steve, let's turn to Intel. Almost every technology we've heard about in the last 2 days requires some kind of digitization. And one of the things that folks are working on is how can we make, we started with electric vehicles, little two-seaters, and now we have SUVs and pickup trucks and delivery trucks. And your side of the thing is things have been getting smaller.
Yes,
Smaller.
very much so.
Smaller. So why don't you tell us a little bit what, the vision that Intel has in their role in this digitization, their handprint, so to speak, on the climate issue.
Well, first of all, thanks, Bob. And I will accept a promotion. I'll also accept a new job because I violated our brand new travel policy to come to this conference.
Well,
and I may not have a job when I get back.
Well, tell them you could tell them you had turned your digitization stuff off,
right.
and that you just didn't realize it
Right.
before you were already en route.
I'll try that.
I'll vouch for that. I'll write a memo.
I'll try that.
Go.
So you referenced Paris before, and if you look at the trajectory of ICCP projections of what is required to avoid, not to solve the problem, notice, but to avoid irreparable damage. That's what we're shooting for. Now we think we need to be net zero. I expect within 5 years, the guidance is going to be we need to be net negative by 2050, and I think we just need to be ready for that. And the only way you get there, in our view, is by optimizing the whole energy system, and I don't mean the energy system as we know it today. I mean the entire economy. And it's known by various terms. The handprint, probably the best expression of it, is what's called optimizing energy. So you electrify everything. You make sure that all those electrons are generated from renewable sources and/or nuclear and/or hydro. We can define what's kosher and what isn't, but it can't come from fossil fuels, the electrons. In the meantime, you've got a huge misfit between the amount of new loads and the amount of electricity that can be generated. And the only way that you match those two or balance the two is through active efficiency. Storage, you have to have a system which is so totally interconnected that everything is balanced at the end of the day. And that's going to require mostly technology that already exists. Every single appliance in your home can be an energy storage device. You can have a battery outfitted into or designed into, preferably, your dishwasher. So your dishwasher, first of all, runs when the price of electricity is lowest during the day if you have time of use rates, but it also generates or stores electricity when it doesn't need to run. And there's an ability to talk to the grid, just like water heaters today can talk to the grid. So there's a huge number of digital technologies that need to come into place. And I will just say, so I don't forget it, we are launching, and this is the first time we publicly announced it, something called the Digital Climate Alliance, jointly with Johnson Controls. We have 10 or 12 other companies, some IT companies, some companies like Johnson Controls that embed IT into their solutions. And we're going to be pushing this story of digitization as not the solution, but one of the solutions to the climate challenge. And betting on the prospect there'll be climate legislation next year, we're going to start to develop some concrete ideas for what should go into that legislation to promote digitization. We're doing this in conjunction with a consulting firm in DC by the name of Coefficient. And so look for news hopefully in the next few months as we expand the effort. And if anybody here is interested in knowing more or perhaps joining, you don't have to be an IT company. If there's IT involved in your solution, we would love to have you be part of our band.
So Here's a question for both of you, and Jim, will start with you and work to Steve. You know, obviously, we're all hearing a lot of information about getting up to scale, you know, with electric vehicles, and Steve, you know, there are all kinds of manufacturing and other issues related to the digitization process, metals that might be needed, or chemical supplies. So obviously we need to scale up. So what do you guys see, you know, as technology is evolving and moving forward? What do you see as barriers or challenges to scaling up? And we'll start, Jim, and then Steve.
Sure, there's a couple of things that we're facing uniquely in the automotive industry. First of all, this is an incredibly capital-intensive business. Last year, we raised $3 billion from the likes of T. Rowe Price, Amazon, Ford, Cox Automotive, and that was great. But you know, $3 billion in any industry sounds like success. For the automotive industry, it's a good start. So really getting that factory up and running. And by the way, we also got lucky there. We bought the old Mitsubishi plant in Bloomington Normal, Illinois, that we're being able to upfit. Now we bought that in 2017 for $16 million. So we basically got a 2.5 million square foot factory ready to go for pennies on the dollar. That's great, but again, it's a good start. Now we've got to upbring that factory, and that's what we've been doing since purchase. So that's number one. It's an incredibly capital-intensive industry where it's heavy machinery. And so there's a lot to do and a lot to put together. Number two, as a disruptor in this space, and Senator Stabenow alluded to this, we're fighting huge incumbencies. And there are two that are really big out there. Senator Stabenow mentioned one of them, the oil and gas industry. So we were very proud supporters of Senator Stabenow's Driving America Forward bill to help expand the federal tax credit. And everyone's like, well, you know, the tax credit, why should we be supplementing these EVs? You know, every manufacturer gets to have 200,000 vehicles as part of this incentive program. Well, you know, that sounds like a lot, but when you think about it, General Motors produces 170,000 gas-powered vehicles each week. So when you think about the scale of that, you know, it's a drop in the bucket. And there was also talk about the cost of this and how it would cost anywhere from $10 to $15 billion to be able to fund the Driving America Forward Act. And again, Senator Stabenow, she kind of stole some of my talking points. She alluded this as well. The oil and gas industry has had tax subsidies and tax breaks for over 100 years. And in that same time period, they will enjoy the benefit of $30 billion in tax credit for an industry that's been around for 100 years. So that's, you know, it's a little bit disparate. And by the way, those tax credits and those subsidies for oil and gas, those are permanent. The Driving America Forward Act is temporary. The other big incumbency that we're fighting that's creating headwinds for us is, believe it or not, our distribution system. So we are fighting a state-by-state battle for Rivian to be able to sell its own vehicles directly to consumers. So we've invented the technology, we've iterated technology, we will build the technology, but there are states that says, okay, now you can't sell it. Now we've got to go through third-party franchise dealers, middlemen, rent seekers, who want a 7 to 10% cut of that, even though they've not contributed to that. Okay, we are not of the scale to do that, number one, and number two, we don't want to lose the seamless touch to our customers so they can have that smooth experience. So I think it's fighting those incumbencies as well as trying to build a brand new company in a very capital-intensive industry.
Steve.
Regarding digitization, I think the biggest obstacles to scale can be summarized. I'm a half-assed economist by training, by the term market failures. And the biggest market failure in our realm is lack of information. This idea that IT not only consumes electricity, and I'm saying IT in the network, so Johnson Controls products, anybody who's got some IT embedded in their good or service, hardware or software. Everybody knows our kit consumes electricity, and our customer's kit. What people don't appreciate is not in video game applications, but in most other applications, IT-based systems can help others save 5 to 10 times, according to ACEEE, the amount of energy they consume. And so there's a lack of information about that fact, which keeps people from adopting these technologies to make their operations more effective. And there's also a threat. We're currently dealing with, in my 20-year career at Intel, the third round of hysteria about data centers. People just, I started at Intel and dealt with the California energy crisis that people thought were a factor of, number one, not enough power plants in California. Not true. Number two, the data centers were exploding and consuming all the electricity. Not true. We've gone through several other rounds of hysteria about data centers, and we're going through one now because of Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is exploding, and people are worried, as they should, about all kinds of because IoT sensors, for the most part, don't operate except when they need to operate, but they consume energy pretty much 24/7, a really small amount of energy. But those systems typically can be used to optimize the energy efficiency of the overall system they're part of, and the savings are much greater, but people can't see the forest for the trees. And there's a lot of interest from the International Energy Agency on down to clamp down on data centers and on IoT devices. I'll just give you two quick factoids, for lack of a better word. The IEA, even though they've expressed some concern about IoT, have started something called the Connected Devices Alliance, which we're part of, to try and make these systems as efficient as possible while still being functional. And they've got a great report, if you have trouble sleeping at night, called The Digitalization of Energy. It's a single best reference on how digital technologies can make the energy system much more effective. And I forgot what the second one was, so I won't try to fake it.
Now you're getting like me. Well, I'm going to take one question from the audience, and then we're going to stop, because I'm pretty certain I don't have a clock up here, although it says we have time, but I think we're probably way behind time. But let's see if we can get one question to these guys, and then we'll stop, turn it over to the next.
How can you see?
I'm trying to see. There's one over there. All right, you're the lucky winner. Here it comes.
Hi, Jim. Congratulations on the launch. It's going to be a fantastic company. I've pre-ordered one of your SUVs, and I'm excited to, or my wife
Thank
has,
you.
actually. And the congratulations go to the way you launched, the fact that you're capacity building, not just for your company, but for Ford, for Amazon, et cetera. So great job. What I didn't hear you say with respect to challenges in the future was, on supply chain and scale, was battery technologies and material, restraints on material, access to the critical materials that go into those batteries. You guys have been fairly quiet about who you're partnering with on your battery side. You have a different strategy, I take it, than Tesla has with its gigafactories. Is that a challenge that you see long-term, and how are you guys working to mitigate it? Do you expect innovations in silica and other ways to develop and ultimately mitigate that for you, or how are you thinking about that challenge?
Yeah, that's a great question, and in fact, you're right. It's a medium to long-term problem. We're focused on launching the vehicles. We do have a cell supplier. We're building the batteries ourselves into modules and the packs. The great news about that is part of our IP is in how we arrange those cells in the packs themselves. It's in our battery management system. It's into our cooling structure. At the end of the day, although the form factor is the 22700 cell, basically the elongated, what I call the C cell stretched out on steroids, is that we're agnostic about the chemistry. So as we're looking at developments in battery technology and new chemistries, that's number one. So R&D into that area that uses materials that are more advanced and perhaps more plentiful. Number two, we're also looking at the full life cycle of the battery itself. And I'm really glad you asked this question, because the one that comes up a lot is, well, what happens when the battery is no longer suitable for transportation use? That's about roughly a decade or more, okay? And it's all dependent on how the battery is used. We've designed our battery packs from the get-go to be second life without remanufacturing. So after the 10 plus years that the battery drops below 70%, which is the threshold for transportation use, we can pull that battery out, and because of the battery management systems, or the BMSs, we can stack those packs and to use them in stationary storage. And they're good for another 10 plus years. So now you're getting 20 plus years, 20, 25 years out of a battery pack. What happens after that? The good news is in lithium-ion batteries, those metals, those constituents, the lithium, the cobalt, the iron, they're not actually consumed. It's all electrons moving back and forth, and then resistance builds. But at the end of the day, you can recycle that battery pack. And in fact, we are working with suppliers, or excuse me, recyclers right now, to figure out how best to recycle that battery pack. We're actually paying a fee to a recycler for our prototype batteries, because we've been around for 11 years. We burned through a lot of packs in developing it, and what they do is they basically tear it apart, pull out all the valuable constituents, the PCBs, the chips, recycle those. They shred what's left, and then they electrochemically pull out the constituents I mentioned, the lithium, the iron, the phosphorus, et cetera, the cobalt. And those are captured, and then that recycler gives us a certain amount of the money we paid back, depending on what they can recover. And so far, we're actually net positive on our fees to that recycler. And we figure as that recycling gets better and better, again, because these constituents are not consumed as part of the battery pack, the cycle will actually get better and better as the supply chain improves.
All right, Steve, you have like a few seconds. You have some similar supply chain issue that vexes you.
No, I'll just tell a quick story.
Very quick.
I was very lucky in my career to be at Intel when Andy Grove was still the chairman. Andy Grove was Time Man of the year that I joined, and Harvard Business Review said the greatest American CEO of the 20th century. He called me one day and he said, you know, I think we should get into the lithium-ion battery business. And he said, I think, this is long before, you know, EVs were out on the street. He said, I think the EV industry will start the way the computer industry started with you know, hobbyists. So he said, I think the vision is Ford F-150s that have battery packs stuck in the back that would be driving around, and that would help develop the economies of scale, et cetera, et cetera. And I said to him two things. One, it's the only time I ever won an argument with Andy Grove. Number one, I said, do you know where the lithium is from? Because he said, we got to get away from the Mideast. I said, do you know where the lithium is from? Bolivia, you know, in countries that are equally unfriendly. And I said, the other thing, I own an F-150. It was bought for my son who went to the University of Michigan. And I drove that around, and I said, do you realize that if you stuck 1,000 pounds of lithium-ion batteries in the back of that pickup truck, that it probably would not be street legal, and the whole, you know, the whole physics and dynamics of handling would change. And he said, oh, okay, never mind.
Well, thank you both, and be around if you can. We're going to be breaking after the next couple of presentations, so I hope you can stay. Thanks.
Thank you.
And next up is Alex Carr, who will do her thing.
Thank you, Bob. Thanks, Bob. And I just want to say it's been such a pleasure working with you and the team for the last 9 years, co-hosting this event, and we look forward to many more. James, after seeing that video, I was really actually kind of hoping we could wrap this conference up with a bit of an Oprah moment. You have a car, you have a car. But maybe next year? So just a quick bit of context setting before we get into the last part of the conference. And if there's one thing that's been made abundantly clear throughout the course of the conference and beyond, it's that we're in the decade of delivery. However, what we also know is that even though awareness and the will to act seem to be at an all-time high, there's still a sizable gap between what needs to be done and the actions and the pledges that are being made by countries around the world. And I think that's probably why we're all here. This is a crisis of such scope and complexity that it can only be fully addressed by working across as many fronts as we can. We need everyone, everywhere, doing everything they can right now. And as Dr. Cobb said a couple of days ago, we really are in an and moment. Corporate leadership, state leadership, city leadership, these are all absolutely essential if we're going to create a more sustainable future, partly because your initiatives reduce emissions, obviously, but also because your actions have a ripple effect beyond your own communities. I'm quoting Rachel Kite. You are providing the steady drumbeat of what can be done, and you're also creating the kind of enabling environment that helps our national governments and international institutions go all in on climate. I had the pleasure of hearing Varshini Prakash from the Sunrise Movement speak a couple of weeks ago. She is much younger than I am, but also much wiser, which isn't too hard. But she said that the cynics will kill us faster than the carbon will, but that the antidote to that cynicism is a can-do attitude. And I think the senator touched on this morning, but that's exactly the kind of attitude that's exemplified by the climate leaders in this country and in this room. So I think that's a cause for celebration, which we saw last night, and also a cause for optimism as we look to the future and to today's discussion. We're going to end on a high note. So just to give you a bit of a roadmap for this morning, this is a session in 3 parts. We're going to have a special announcement, then we're going to have a short presentation, and then we're going to have a conversation about the nature of climate leadership in 2020, and hopefully have some time for questions. So with no further ado, I'd like to introduce to the stage Diane Leopold, Executive Vice President and Co-Chief Operating Officer of Dominion Energy. Diane is a leading voice on innovation and environmental sustainability and has spearheaded the industry's most aggressive plan for reducing methane emissions. Breaking news, as of this week, Diane is also serving as the chair of the American Gas Association. So please join me in welcoming Diane to the stage.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here today, and I thank everybody for hanging with it and staying for this last session. Thank you to Bob and everybody at C2ES for your outstanding leadership. Thanks to all of you and others, the private sector, the environmental community, and leading climate scientists are working together on common sense climate solutions. We're sharing ideas and even coming up with new ones together. Most of all, we're making a real difference. The CEO Climate Dialogue is a perfect example. For the first time in a long time, the private sector and the environmental community are united in support of a comprehensive federal climate policy. We're making progress, but we cannot wait. We must take action now, and the private sector must lead the way. At Dominion Energy, we're proud to be part of developing the solution. Our customers and our communities deserve a clean environment today and a sustainable planet for future generations. It's our responsibility to deliver on that promise. A few weeks ago, Dominion Energy announced our own commitment to achieve net zero emissions across all of our electric and natural gas operations by 2050. We're taking a comprehensive approach to tackle both carbon and methane. We are focused on 3 steps on this journey. Step 1, we must lower our emissions as much as possible and as fast as possible. We've already cut our carbon emissions in half since 2005 and our methane emissions by 1/4 since 2010. We've replaced most of our coal fleet with high-efficiency, state-of-the-art natural gas units. We've built the 4th largest solar fleet in the nation. And we've launched one of the most aggressive programs in the industry to reduce methane emissions from our natural gas infrastructure network. But that's in the past. We need to act now to protect the future. We are not only focused on the end game, but also the path. We can't wait and hope for some unknown technology to get us there in the final decade. On the electric side of our business, we're expanding renewables as fast as we possibly can. We're building the largest offshore wind project in the nation off the coast of Virginia, and we're bringing 3,000 megawatts of new solar online over the next few years. Just to put that in perspective, that's enough zero-carbon electricity to power nearly 1.5 million homes at peak output. We're also extending the licenses of our nuclear fleet, which provides zero-carbon electricity to 1.5 million more, and we're continuing to replace coal with natural gas. For our natural gas infrastructure, we've laid out a clear plan to slash methane emissions by 65% over the next 10 years and 80% in the next 20 years. Our program includes a significant expansion of our leak detection program and purchasing equipment to reduce or virtually eliminate methane that used to escape to the atmosphere during our maintenance practices. These actions are 100% voluntary, and the costs have not yet been approved by the regulators, but we've already started them because we know that they're the right thing to do. So step 2, as we focus on an immediate plan to reduce our own emissions, we can help lower other industries' carbon footprints as fast as possible too. We all know about the 80-20 rule. Once we have a path to lower our own emissions, we can move to focus on supporting others. Because of our infrastructure, utilities are uniquely capable of supporting the transition of the industrial, agricultural, and transportation sectors to a low-carbon future. Examples include the rapid build-out of electric vehicle charging infrastructure and the conversion of Virginia's school buses from diesel to electric. In addition, we're partnering with Smithfield Foods, Vanguard Renewables, and others to reduce methane emissions from our nation's farms. These partnerships plan to invest $700 million over the next few years in projects that are actually carbon negative, meaning they capture more carbon than they emit. These are big investments we're making to bend the greenhouse gas emissions curve as fast as possible. Step 3 is to get to net zero. We're actively engaged in exploring new and emerging technologies to get across the finish line. We're piloting large-scale energy storage and supporting significant studies in hydrogen, carbon capture, and advanced nuclear. We're evaluating the role programs such as reforestation can play to help the planet. And we're working with policymakers to support and help spur these technological advances even further. But we must acknowledge that as much as we want a simple result, the energy grid is highly complex and the solutions are not easy. In fact, there is no one right solution. We need to stay focused on the path and not allow unintended consequences of a higher carbon footprint or threaten reliability because we let perfect get in the way of great progress. Nor should we be satisfied that great is good enough. Investments in a broad range of technology solutions is critical to a resilient, lasting success. As you can probably tell, I'm passionate about the solutions that can make the most difference as quickly as possible. We can't wait for new technologies to become commercially viable before we act. There's plenty we can and must do now. It is in the relentless drive to incrementally lower emissions that we will get there. Climate change is an incredible challenge. I truly believe we can change the future for the better. The solutions are within our reach, and there's greater resolve than ever before to put them into action. We must keep working together to build the future we all want to see. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane, and I'm sure Marc will pick up some of those threads in our conversation a little bit later. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Erin Meezan, Chief Sustainability Officer from Interphase, which has been a sustainability pioneer for over 2 decades, as those of us old enough to remember Ray Anderson's iconic speech can attest. As CSO, Erin leads a global team that addresses sustainability at all levels of Interphase's business. She's also a frequent lecturer and keynote on sustainable business, and she serves as a guest faculty member at Harvard University. Please welcome Erin to the stage.
Hi, everyone. last day, hang in there. I'm here to spend about 10 or 15 minutes telling you a really quick story about something that we kicked off in 2015 at Interphase, a little project called the Climate Takeback. And it came out of the fact that I was convinced in 2015 that our company needed to step up our ambition and set much more aggressive goals on climate in the business. And two things really influenced me to get there. The first is that I had the privilege of being I had the privilege to attend part of the Paris negotiations. And despite my height, I was invited by the Dutch delegation to be part of the events surrounding kind of the Paris Accord in December of 2015. And while the kind of negotiation of the Paris Accord in 2015 was a huge milestone to be celebrated, what literally started happening the next day was the conversation about the fact that keeping warming to 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees, possibly to 1 degree, wasn't enough. And as much as we celebrated, and many of us did, the signing of the Paris Accord the following April, the increasing conversation as plans were being developed was the need to greatly increase our ambition. The second was really the fact that our company had reached a major milestone the year before. I work for a billion-dollar flooring company that's less famous for our products and much more famous for our CEO, who 25 years into the business, redesigned the business, transformed it under a vision of sustainability, and really made the cultural change at the business that shifted how we do business and the types of products that we make. And we were coming on sort of reaching the end of an almost 2-decade focus on this mission. We had done everything we could to reduce the footprint of the business. 100% of the energy that we use in US and Europe comes from renewable sources. 96% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. 92% reduction in waste to landfill. And so these two kind of moments were hitting us in the sense that it was time to give ourselves a new target and raise our level of ambition, but also the world was asking something greater. And one of the first barriers that we ran into, and for us we're increasingly seeing in our customer base and our employees, is this first barrier of understanding that it is possible to address global warming. It sounds ridiculous, but we've spent more than 3 decades trying to convince people there is a problem and very little time talking about the pathway to solve it. So it's not surprising when we went to our new CEO and said we want to declare a much more ambitious mission at Interphase around climate, and we want it to be centered on reversing global warming. And he sort of said, all right, I need to think about that for a little bit. But what I will tell you is that I don't understand as a CEO if it's scientifically possible to do that. I don't see the pathway. I don't understand what a business plan would look like for that, and I don't know where the business opportunity is. But we're a moonshot company. Interphase is one of the few companies that's done this before, so I think we have the culture, the innovation, and the people to actually deliver that. So he went ahead in 2016, stood up in front of a room full of our customers and others, and said, we're going to declare that Interphase is shifting its focus. And I think what's really important about this is that a company stepped out and said, we're no longer thinking about this false corporate goal of our emissions and our footprint and what we have to do. We're naming the goal we have to have, the world needs to have, which is to create a climate fit for life. And that will drive the mindset and the business strategy that we put in place to do this, right? So we started to build a plan for him, and we started with the science. And we had to do a lot of convincing with our CEO and our senior team to talk about what is the pathway. And we started at the work of Johan Rockström at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And while this is a ridiculously complicated graph that I further had to simplify for our senior team, it says 3 really important things. We don't stop at net zero. Company ambitions on climate and strategies have to go well beyond zero because the scientific pathway to solving this is 3 simple things. The first is that gray bit. That's net zero. We have to decrease carbon emissions as quickly as possible across all sectors, right? We all know that. But the other two pieces are an equally important part of the strategy. The yellow and the orange bar that's called human carbon sinks. That's all about carbon removal. The second part of solving this is we have to remove all the excess carbon that's already in the atmosphere through new technologies, through direct air capture, through better agriculture, through protection, through new innovation, removing that carbon from the atmosphere, using more biomaterials to make buildings and products. And then the green and the blue is we have to do those two things. Stop putting more up there and get to zero as quickly as possible and start actively removing that. We have to do those things while we're equally protecting and enhancing the existing sinks on the planet. So once we explained that to our CEO and our senior team, the next step was to actually break it down another level and say if we had a business approach to doing this, these are the components of our business strategy. We have to continue to radically decarbonize Interphase and its supply chain as a business. And as a billion-dollar flooring manufacturer, for us, that means really changing the supply chain and the people who make our materials. We have to find ways as a product manufacturer to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And the third way is we have to do all of that while protecting those important natural sinks. So we wrote a plan. We put it on our website. You can download it. We've actively been sharing it with our competitors, with our customers, and others in the built environment space. And one of the most important things we learned in going through this process was that in order to create a business strategy, we needed to map that science against our plan. So the first part for us was continuing to focus on decarbonize the business. The second part we call love carbon, and it was really about finding ways that we can utilize low carbon materials, carbon negative materials in our products, in the manufacture of our products. The third we already talked about, which is protecting those natural buffers. But the last part is really important too, because we are just a billion-dollar company and only about 5,000 employees around the world. The most important thing that Interphase can do is first model this behavior and what it actually looks like. But the second is engage the rest of the people in the built environment space. So this idea of leading the industrial revolution for us actually means bringing that learning to our customers. It means changing policies and engaging in advocacy. One of the really interesting things we've decided to do this year is hire a lobbying firm in the state of California and expand California's Buy Clean law that was passed in 2017. That's a piece of legislation that says as the state of California is doing new construction projects, they have to consider the embodied carbon of those construction materials. They have to make better decisions, right? So we're actively looking to expand that to include all of the interiors products and buildings. That's what it means by leading an industrial re-revolution. We've also created a coalition of other manufacturers who sell products in the built environment space. Insulation, drywall, flooring, all of the pieces and components you see in this room have a carbon footprint associated with them, and many times that can be half of the carbon associated with the entire space, right? So we've got to sort of bring together a coalition of manufacturers, find a way to actually drive this and make it a reality. So this is the plan and the strategy that Interphase follows when we try to achieve a stated goal that we've put out there, which is to be a carbon negative company across all three scopes of our business, including our supply chain, by 2040. So that means we'll continue to decarbonize the products and the operations. Right now, all of the products that we make around the world are actually climate neutral as a standard attribute. I'll talk a little bit about a new product innovation that we have coming that actually loves carbon in a minute. And when we think about, okay, so the vision is science, our business strategy must follow that. What will it look like in operation to actually put this in place in a business? And for us, it's a lot of the commitments that businesses have already made. When we think about living zero, it's all of those strategies we're already doing to decarbonize, whether that's efficiency in our factories, whether that's using new materials, whether it's increasingly recycling and bringing our products back, whether it's looking at resource-efficient transportation, all of the things that we've already talked about to date, right? But the second piece of that moving to carbon removal is finding a way as a product manufacturer to actually use this to create new products, whether that's looking at using biomaterials that in and of themselves store much carbon than perhaps a petroleum-derived material, whether that's actually capturing durable carbon from the atmosphere and using that to make plastics or energy to run operations. It's that sort of lens that we have to use and develop and really build on the ability to exercise the ability to sort of remove carbon from the atmosphere as a business. So this is a really exciting thing that we're going to announce in May. As a maker of flooring products and carpet tiles and rubber, this is our medium. And I think actually what's really funny about this slide is, I can't see it from here, but I think on the very bottom it says internal use only, may not be used externally until approved by the marketing team. I love that. Just so you know, I have approval. And frankly, the lesson for the marketing team is you don't give something to the chief sustainability officer if you don't want it to be shown publicly. I just noticed that last night. But as a maker of flooring products and carpet tiles, this is where rubber meets the road in terms of loving carbon. What does it actually look like to integrate that? Our canvas, our medium, and what we're working on to achieve this is really going to be focused on products and operations. So when we say we want to remove more carbon from the atmosphere than the business emits, that means we're looking at strategies at the factory level to go beyond a zero carbon factory, and we're looking at what can we do in our factories to actually sequester and store carbon. Is that terrestrial sequestration? Is it green roofs? Is it removing all the parking lots we have and planting grass? Is it different goals and targets, right? That's a small part of it, but the biggest piece as a product manufacturer and our medium is our products. So this year we will announce the ability to make and produce the world's first carbon negative carpet tile. When measured, the materials, which is the biggest part of the carbon footprint of a product, themselves are carbon neutral, enough to offset the energy made to manufacture it. And we've been on a 5-year journey to do this. So I said we started in 2015. In 2016, we announced this mission. In 2017, we challenged our innovation team to create a carpet tile that loves carbon, that throughout the footprint of the entire process, that would be a net carbon negative carpet tile, and launch a prototype in the market, because we wanted to do two things. We wanted to wake up the built environment space to the fact that we need to go beyond low carbon and carbon neutral, and that the future is really carbon negative products. But we also wanted to sort of show our competitors and our company itself what was possible. So we launched a prototype in the market in 2017. In 2018, we commercialized the backing component of that. Last year, we spent about $50 million to change the backing lines in all of our factories around the world to have the capability to produce carbon negative products. And despite the marketing team not wanting me to announce it here, in a couple of months, we will announce that we have put the world's first carbon negative carpet tile out there. In and of itself, flooring, may not get everybody in this room out of bed every morning, but it's not the flooring itself, it's the idea of what's possible. The second we introduce a carbon negative carpet tile into the built environment space, we are starting to work with our customers to change what they ask for, to change their specifications. When the state of California sees that it's possible to buy carbon negative carpet, they're going to start asking our competitors for that. They're going to start asking lighting companies and drywall companies and insulation manufacturers and furniture companies where their carbon negative products are. We're going to build carbon negative into market mechanisms like LEED and WELL, and we're going to continue to influence what the built environment space looks like. And for those of you who don't work in my industry or the built environment space, added up, it's about 40% of global carbon emissions. So as much as we want to talk about transportation and energy, let's not forget buildings. Let's not forget building construction, and the construction of all of the materials that goes into those spaces is a significant part of the carbon. And the way you see that, we break it out in terms of embodied carbon and operational carbon. When you turn on the lights in a building and you turn on the HVAC and you start plugging in your computers, that's operational carbon. When you are building the building and you are looking at the carbon emissions associated with the wood, the concrete, the steel, that's embodied carbon. And the interesting thing about interiors is when you sit in a room like this, oftentimes the flooring is the most significant part of the embodied carbon in the interiors. Why? Because we use high-performing engineered materials like nylon. And to the extent that we can show customers where that carbon is in the built environment and allow them to make choices, we will be doing our part to actually not just shift the footprint of our business, but to actually change the entire built environment space. And so I will leave you guys with this. It's been a 5-year journey for us that started because we changed our mindset. We adopted a much more ambitious goal that, frankly, most companies know is coming. So if you're in a business, if you purchase products, if you're running sustainability for an organization, I want you to really think about what your carbon negative carpet tile is, what your 5-year plan is to get to carbon negative, and what you're going to take from this conference and go implement back in your business that's equivalent to the level of ambition that we need to save the planet. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Erin. It's super exciting to see the new frontiers of climate leadership. So I'd now like to ask the final member of our triumvirate to the stage to join us for our final conversation of the conference. Welcome Marc Webb, who is the Senior Vice President and Chief Innovation Officer at Dominion Energy.
Thank you.
So yes, I am. I'm on. So why don't you kick us off, Marc, and tell us a little bit more about your work at Dominion?
So I'll talk a little bit. I know Diane just spoke and talked about our corporate goals that we've just announced, so I don't want to rehash that. But one of the ways that we expect to be able to meet those targets and the link between energy of the future and sustainability is through innovation. And so what we're looking at is through our innovation efforts, we're focused on across the board, all the things you've heard about, from decentralized resources, decarbonization of transportation, and interesting, we're very focused, and Stephen Harper mentioned, is the growth of exponential data and digitalization, how that may drive our ability to meet those targets. So through that and through those focus areas, we have really focused in terms of transportation as an example, in terms of decarbonizing it. It's led to some of our initiatives that have been referenced here, from electric school buses, piloting an autonomous shuttle. But those are the drivers for us as we look at, we believe that there are many things out there that we can do as we progress innovation, not just by us. As a utility, we apply innovation. We take others' innovations and apply them in ways that we can better deliver the energy that our customers use to power their lives, to power their cities, to power their businesses. But with that, we have this effect on sustainability, and it's intertwined with innovation, and innovation will be the driver.
Great. We're going to come back to innovation. But I wanted to start with a question around ambition. So since COP25, if not before, there's been a lot of conversation about how to ratchet up ambition, how to ratchet up climate action for all sorts of good reasons. Each of your organizations have incredibly impressive climate goals. So can you tell us a little bit about how you've engaged the senior leadership team? How did you get buy-in? How did you increase their ambition around the commitments and priorities?
So from my perspective, I didn't have to engage the senior leadership team.
Right.
It starts with our CEO, and he is engaged.
Yeah.
It's the #1 focus, and he's set the agenda, and we're all engaged. And with that support, it is every time he speaks to employees, he talks about our goals, the turn that the company is making, and the way we deliver energy, and that's driving it. And when you have that behind you, people are very receptive. And it enables us to go through the organization at every level and seek to create a culture that is very different for a utility.
Yeah.
We operate multiple utilities in 18 states. Innovation has not always been the goal of utilities. It's been low cost and reliable service,
Yep.
Whether it's electric or gas. But when you start to talk about innovation, and that they know that part of the goal of innovation is to reduce emissions, be it carbon or methane, the idea is, and you start a forum and a way to take ideas from procedures, the big and the small. It's amazing the effect it has when you throughout the organization, when there is a clear direction set from the top, in terms of this is our goal, this is what will guide our strategy for the coming 5 years, 10 years, and 30 years.
Great. And I suspect you have a very similar perspective, Erin. Probably haven't had to do a ton of engagement at the
Well,
senior
it's
levels.
interesting. I mean, I had a new CEO to Interphase who wasn't exactly a sustainability champion in his prior life, and certainly wasn't ready to sign up the first day I went to him and said, we think the new mission of the company is to reverse global warming. he wasn't ready for that, quite simply. And I think lots of CEOs are in that place. They think our company has to have a response to climate. Maybe we want to be in a leadership position. But I fundamentally think that many CEOs would tell you exactly what mine was able to articulate, which I think took a lot of confidence, which is to say, I actually don't think this is scientifically possible. I don't understand how we can store enough carbon to get the Earth back on track. I mean, I think that was a very astute observation, and the fact that he was able to articulate that being a big barrier was important. I think the second thing he said, which is what any other CEO would say, is, I don't understand how this helps the business. What is the business pathway to actually getting there? So we actually did a couple of things with him. We brought in some outside environmental advisors, and we had a very small meeting that was not the senior leadership team, that was not everyone in the world. It was about 10 people in our company, including our CEO, and we talked about that science that I showed you. And we had deep conversations about what carbon removal actually means and what it would mean in the context of a product manufacturer, meaning we would have to find new raw materials, we would have to build a new supply chain, we would have to get customers to buy it, we would have to market the hell out of it and change market mechanisms and pulls. And when we were able to have that conversation, he was one step further. And I think the other thing that really influenced it was the early wave of kind of the citizen movement starting to happen and what we were hearing at companies like Amazon. So if I were in the seat now convincing a new CEO, I would be sharing that information with my CEO, saying, here's a company who actually has a business pathway. That's why we made our plan public. That's why it's on our website. And companies have reached out to us and said, could you come and talk to our senior leadership team about what it actually looks like? I'd be sending my CEO the commitments that companies like Microsoft have made and said, actually, this is what leadership looks like. Net zero, not enough anymore. And if we're only at net zero, man, we are far behind. I would get him in other spaces with other CEOs who are able to have that closed door conversation and talk about the business opportunity, because our company firmly believes that those carbon negative products are going to differentiate us. We're going to win specifications, and we're going to make more money than our competitors. And I think it's important for a CEO to tell other CEOs that.
Yeah. Well, as you say, there are a lot of examples right now. Larry Fink's letter to CEOs, right? Powerful signal. Shout out to fellow Canadian Marc Carney and his work with the Bank of England and soon to be UN. So that's great. So related question around the sort of the story, the evolving story of sustainability and climate. We sort of started this conversation in the green room and where the function, the sustainability and climate function should sit optimally. So it started, as we all know, from a place of compliance, managing regulatory risk, the lawyers were handling it, et cetera. Moved into sort of the space that I work in, communications, reputational risk. And now it's sort of really kind of, it's all over the place. So I spoke with someone, I think yesterday, whose most senior sustainability person was heading up their investor relations function. You've got someone in the C-suite here, a senior executive who's got innovation in their title. So what do you is there an optimal place for the function, particularly given we need kind of systems thinking to get to some of the solutions and the changes that we need? Do you want to start, Erin?
I think if you want to influence the strategy of the company, which is where it all needs to be, it needs to be in the C-suite. Yeah. And whether or not it's combined with sustainability and innovation, I think really falls down to what kind of company you actually are. Yeah. But I don't think it can be in the communications function. I think it needs to be fundamentally built into the strategy of a business, and we need to depend on it helping to be a part of the growth of that business, right? Yep.
And I think for us, it is in the C-suite. I think we look at it as that it is every leader's responsibility. Yeah. And every employee's. I mean, when you focus employees on our commitments, and that there's a new driver, and that in terms of every project they look at, they now have a lens that in addition to ROI or improvement in customer efficiency or reliability, they're also thinking about the emissions or the cross-sustainability efforts in terms of water usage. They think across the board, and that comes from the top. It comes from the business unit heads, and everyone thinks that way. I think in terms of the C-suite, we're really just the quarterbacks. With innovation, we're directing it, but innovation occurs in each of the business units too. And primarily, they're the ones who are driving it. Sustainability is the same way. The corporate sustainability officer is, analyzing the targets, analyzing the science and how you calculate the targets. But at a high level, every single business unit is focused on how they're going to meet the expectations.
So is that embedded in performance targets? Is that embedded in the purpose of the organization? How does it manifest?
It's certainly embedded in the purpose, and I think as we are, in terms of how it is embedded in performance targets, it's evolving,
Right.
but
Yep.
I think we'll, in some way, shape, or form, we'll get there, whether it's in
Yep.
terms of concrete projects that lead to it or in terms of parameters.
Yeah.
It's similar to what we did years ago. We began an initiative on safety, and it's becomes everyone's responsibility. And when it's a corporate goal, goals get met. And that's the way it works in a corporation. So when it becomes a goal, it gets met. And I think people, and this is a goal that people really, the reception from employees, it's been, there's been a hunger. People live in the communities, they see it, and people want it. And I think there's never been a more positive or turn for our company in terms of the reception from employees than the commitments that we're making on the climate and sustainability overall.
Great. Well, that's a good segue to the next question I'd love to ask. So we've talked a little bit about your influence within an organization. So can you talk a little bit about that influence sort of beyond, well, with your employees potentially? Marc, you sort of as part of a public utility, you're in a unique position to influence customer behavior. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think that we, obviously public utilities have a different role in that they were created for specific purposes to ensure that there is energy delivered that powers the economy, that makes our cities operate as we know that as they operate today. And they had a goal. It was do it cheaply, serve everyone, and do it reliably. I think as we tackle the challenges, all those things still must be met. We serve everyone. It has to be affordable, it has to be reliable, but sustainability in the climate is ideally suited for the model of a public service corporation that was designed to serve everyone and to accomplish large societal goals.
Yeah.
And so obviously when we deliver renewable electricity or a much cleaner and far lower emissions natural gas to someone who heats their home with natural gas, they're immediately more sustainable. And it helps someone like Interphase meet their targets. But we can even go beyond that, and that in terms of the impact and the counter impacts that we can have, the pancaking effects, the school bus example.
Yeah.
And that if we can look at that and say, we can look at batteries as a resource. They can power transportation, they can power the grid, or sometimes they can do both. And so we began looking at transportation in the school buses as a unique application for buses that were idle half of the year, 180 days a year, ran predictable schedules, is stored at the exact same place every single day, runs known schedules, runs known miles every day on the routes. It's a perfect opportunity to begin deploying the vehicle-to-grid technology and to get a usage from a battery that both serves the grid and powers a school bus and takes kids to school without diesel emissions, which cleans the air inside the bus for kids. The win-win-win effect of the things that we can do as a public utility, because we're starting with one goal. It has the pancaking effect in ways that not every other industry has.
Well, and the educational impact of sending those buses out into the community as well, I assume, it's pretty big.
It's tremendous. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that it's, the reception for that from parents in particular has been overwhelming.
Well, we know the kids are the ones telling their parents, right? They need to do something about this. I know mine are. Erin, you guys are doing such amazingly innovative things with your product, and I'm guessing that has a big impact for your supply chain. So can you talk a little bit about your influence there?
Sure. I think it's kind of two ends of it. The first is really on the supply chain where, we started 20 years ago introducing ideas of sustainability. We've done different things to engage the supply chain, some of which is shifting our purchasing power as a result of an innovation challenge. So 15 years ago, we said to our 3 primary nylon suppliers, we split our business between 3 of you. The first one of you who can give us a recycled content nylon, we're going to give you the bulk of our business. When we wanted to push them even further to sort of show them what a social enterprise model looked like, we actually created a pilot project in the Philippines where we worked with local communities to harvest ghost fishing nets, gave them a wage for the harvesting and the processing, and then showed that to our supply chain. And the interesting thing about that is we had been talking to our suppliers for years about how do we go beyond environmental sustainability to social, and it was an abstract concept. So when we funded a small pilot project, when it started to get amazing PR, everyone suddenly got interested in those models. So sometimes it's been a purchasing power approach, sometimes it's been funding an innovation pilot, but I think the bigger power we have now is in our customer base. And so we've spent a lot of time over the last year educating our architects and designers, the universities and the big corporates who, purchase the flooring products to really understand how much carbon is in a building. And we do that by asking our salespeople to go out and not just present products, but give a talk on embodied carbon. Almost like a continuing education credit, they do that. We've actually funded tools that are now launching in the built environment space where designers and others picking products can compare the carbon footprints of interior materials against each other and pick the lowest option. That's called the Embodied Carbon in Construction Calculator tool. It's free, it's online, it plugs into a lot of building software. And so this idea of first we have to build awareness, then we have to build the tools, then the next step is we're now working with several kind of green building standards to incorporate the idea of carbon negative as an innovation credit for products. So I think we're learning that if we want to scale this as quickly as possible, if we want to see the impact over the next 10 years, we can't just design the products.
Yeah.
We have to create the demand and be a part of doing that.
Yeah, that's great. I've got a couple more questions, but I'm also aware that folks in the audience might have some, and I want to give them the chance because I know we're rapidly running out of the time. I can't see anything, but does anybody have a question?
No, it's impossible to see.
Oh, one over there.
Erin, amazing work and congrats on your Fearless Leadership nomination from Sustainable Brands. Everyone check that out for Women's Day in 2 days, right? So I hear you completely on the business case, but I feel like the built environment has a much larger incentive to do initiatives like you're doing in terms of having those C-suite conversations because there's so much incentivization around lead credits and stuff. So what about other companies, consumer product companies, where there's not a direct, immediate way to, if it does result in a higher cost product or a higher cost to the business, like, do you have any high-level recommendations? I know there's lots of different sectors and nuances there.
I think, I take that as fair. The built environment, has gone through a revolution in the last 2 decades as green buildings and all of the certification systems have come online that allows us to plug into these market mechanisms for sure. But I think the same is true on the consumer side. What drove that transformation in the built environment was actually building awareness early on with architects and designers about the damage associated with the decisions they were making on bad design or high energy design or building boxes in places that fundamentally had negative impacts on the places they were building them. And so what started all that was, awareness building around the impact of good design. And I think there's a parallel there on the consumer side, which, a lot of the strategies around building awareness could be deployed. But one thing that needs to happen, that happened in the built environment space, was you had companies coming together with a really clear common message. What we hear on the consumer side of the business is like, there's too many messages, there's too many labels, I don't understand what's the best thing to do. And as much as I, don't relish the idea of government regulation, it may be a really good time for the FDA or others to step in, whether it's in the food sector or others, and very clearly define and start to clean up what's a most sustainable, what's a sort of not sustainable, and what's a choice you can make, whether that's by, adding to the nutrition label, whether that's a fundamentally different system. I kind of feel like it could help. We're to the point in the consumer sector where there's too many confusing messages. The other thing I think could happen is consumer companies could align. And you see some of this in the outdoor apparel industry, and I think Patagonia has been fantastic on their leadership, and they have driven that sector to align behind them. That could happen in the food sector. And to a certain extent, Stonyfield has driven some of that and done some work in the early days. But I think the government could get involved. I think we could see much more collaboration amongst consumer-facing products that could develop either a clear and unified certification label, more information. What we also do in the built environment space is we issue something called environmental product declarations, which are like nutrition labels for the products. Some consumer version of that, I think, could be really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. And is there any other question? One more question I think we have time for? Can't see.
God, it's so bright up here. There's one right there.
Junko Suba from Steinberg Asset Management. I have a question to Erin. Thank you so much for sharing your initiatives, and clearly a market leader. I'm curious to understand if the financial markets, you feel that the financial markets reward you for the things that you do today, because you're clearly a leader, you're having an impact today, you're definitely going to have an impact into the future. Do you feel that that value has been translated into financial value, particularly in terms of your market valuation? I guess I could ask that of Dominion Energy as well, so thank you.
I mean, obviously, I'm going to say no. I feel like it should be reflected in a higher stock value. But what's been a really interesting disconnect is, even though BlackRock is kind of one of the biggest ones, one of our biggest investors consistently, what I find and what I hear from my colleagues in the built environment sector is the BlackRock letter comes out, but the day-to-day interaction we have with the BlackRock investors who work with our IR team, there isn't necessarily a strong connection there. So rarely are those people on calls talking about or asking about how quickly we're going to decarbonize the business. We just announced 2 weeks ago this $50 million investment in changing over technology globally. Not one investor on the call asked about it. Not one investor said, wow, that's an amazing step forward. I can actually see the value associated with you decarbonizing. You're in sort of the built environment space. I just don't think we see the connection at all. What I think is encouraging, though, is the growth of investors starting to look at those ESG scores. 5 years ago, no one would ask us what our number was. And we are actually starting to see investors ask, how did you score on this? We're having to increase our efforts with investors to talk about that proactively, so I think that's a good sign.
Marc, do you want to?
Yeah, I think, for us, it's very hard to attribute particular fluctuations in the stock price or value to any one thing. Certainly, we have a lot of investors who are ESG type or even just some commitment on those things are very important to them. And they wouldn't be investors if we didn't pursue it. I think again, just from operating as public utilities in different states and different companies, commitments that we're making and going beyond what may be required by a federal law or a federal statute, it's making our business sustainable as a business for the long term. So I think the expectation is there. It drives long-term value because anyone looking into the horizon knows that the path may not be entirely clear, but you know that over this time horizon, you've got to transform and you have to be there. And if you're not doing it, I think there would be a penalty.
Thank you. Well, since this is the last question and answer for the entire conference, let's go out. Let's go out on a high note. So this is my favorite question, and I do apologize, but I like we deal with a lot of tough information, and so I want to hear from you both. What is giving you the most hope and the most inspiration as you look towards the next decade? Do you want to start, Marc?
Sure, I'll start. I just think in terms of what gives me hope, I think, is that as the innovation officer, we have all kinds of companies who come to us with ideas. And the hope is that market economics works. The number of companies out there who are focused on things like storage goes beyond lithium ion, it goes beyond into using materials that are far more sustainable. There's an idea presented every day in terms that leads to a more sustainable energy grid. So entrepreneurialism works, market economics works, it's driving innovation. People see a need and they respond. So I think that gives me hope. And in terms of inspiration, I think what has inspired me is our own employees and the way they've responded. When we set these goals, to see how it permeates every level in terms of the way people think. We've got meter readers people who change gas meters at homes who come up with new processes that reduces methane leakage during a change out of a meter. When we have a meter reader who comes up with a new way to keep a meter from freezing during the wintertime, and instead of using fiberglass, he proposed using a denim-based material that's reusable so that you wouldn't send the fiberglass to the landfill every year. It shows you that to the very, throughout the organizations, the message is out there because he was thinking about safety, he was thinking about sustainability, and he was thinking about reliability, all at the same time. And when you see that, you know that what you're doing is resonating. And I think that the response from employees, they were waiting. And they want to do it, and they want to do what they can because they live in these communities too. They live in their states, and so they want to respond, and they feel that they can, and now they're empowered to do it.
And there's an alignment of personal and professional priorities.
There's an alignment.
Yeah, powerful. That's amazing. Erin?
I think two things. The conversation has definitely shifted in the last 5 years in the built environment space where I am, from this idea of acceptance that net zero is not enough. And how companies are quickly responding to go beyond that is great. And I think the second is, we've never engaged a lobbying firm or done policy work at our company before. And it's been incredibly hopeful for me to see that in a 6-month time span, we found a lobbyist, identified a way that we could scale a solution on embodied carbon with the state of California, actually got a legislator to meet with us. The guy who sponsored the first bill actually agreed to sponsor amending it, and it's actually moving. And maybe it's because I don't work in politics and I have a perception of it, but I'm incredibly encouraged that change can happen quickly. And we may not get it past this year, but I think the idea that it exists and that we can now show other states and other legislatures what's happening, that's incredibly encouraging to me.
Great. Well, I think it's a great note to go out on. So thank you for your leadership. Thank you for being here. We look forward to seeing what you do next. Can you please join me in thanking Marc and Erin?
Thank you, everybody, all our die-hard Climate Leadership Conference people that we have here. I assume that if you're going on a tour, is anybody going on a tour that's still in the room? Okay, great. I will give you a little tour information. The place, they're starting the tours at 12:30. The tours for Little Caesar Arena and the TCF Center are both meeting on the second floor lobby, and you'll be walking to your tours together. And then we will have volunteers in the lobby directing people to the meeting places for those tours. For the O'Shea Solar Park, hosted by DT and Bees in the D, you will meet inside near the Michigan Avenue entrance near Starbucks at 12:15. So good luck with that one. They're running behind. They're waiting for you. And you can order lunch and drinks to go. Free bar drinks on that, because you've got a shuttle driver. So it's like a party van. It's there. Okay, great. Okay. So anyways, it's been wonderful spending the week with everybody here in Detroit and with our wonderful partners at C2ES. I'm inspired and excited, and the only thing that I can think is that's better than this year's Climate Leadership Conference will be next year's Climate Leadership Conference. Bob?
And I couldn't agree more. When you get the right people on stage and experts talking amongst themselves and with the audience and the right folks in the room, it's spontaneous combustion, and that's what we've seen in terms of ideas and flow. So I'm leaving inspired, and I hope everyone else is leaving inspired, and they've found something to share, and they learned something, and they've already marked their calendar the first week in March next year. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Safe travels home.